President Biden's executive order empowers the State Department and Treasury to be able to sanction those seen in the future to be standing in the way.
If the government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front take meaningful steps to enter into talks without preconditions and allow unhindered humanitarian...
The United States and its allies must continue to transition and do so quickly from a position of hands-off diplomacy, like encouragement, engagement, and talking to the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments, to hands-on action.
All sides are guilty of abuses, but the fragmentary reporting we have indicates that Ethiopian, Eritrean, and allied militia have disproportionately been responsible for targeting civilians in a manner that is both reckless and sinister. We appear to be witnessing war crimes and crimes against humanity.
The United States and the international media has been mounting a relentless pressure on the East African country Ethiopia. The issue has blown up to the level of national security threat, according to the US president. Moreover, we are now seeing the customary pre-war drumbeats of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, Syria and others. How did Ethiopia go from being the reliable ally of the US to an alleged national security threat? Ethiopia was under the rule of the Tigrayan People Liberation Front (TPLF) for the last quarter of a century. This group came to power by the barrel of gun and unleashed an iron fist rule on the people. Then came 2018, when the public uprising resulted in a regime change. A pragmatic and a charismatic young leader named Abiy Ahmed, from one of the major ethnic groups in the country, took power. The new government quickly moved to democratize the country, and dig out the people from the entrenched ethnic divisions, corruption and decays of the brutal TPLF leadership. It freed up political prisoners, invited dissident politicians to participate in the political process of the country. It made peace with the warring neighboring country Eritrea, promising the first free and transparent election. It set out to revolutionize the economy to fight poverty and begin the country's healing process. This seems to be all aligned with the interest of the Western world, and one would think America would be cheerleading for him. He was even recognized to be the Nobel Peace Prize winner in 2019. Well, as it was later witnessed, Abiy Ahmed did three things that US despised him for. First, he rejected to sign tripartite binding agreement on future filling of the dam brokered by the US, which unjustifiably was taken as a slap on the face by US. Second, Abiy ignored signals to distance Ethiopia from China, with whom US is waging an economic Cold War. Finally, the US did not appreciate the neo-Pan-African fervor the new leader advocates. He believes African countries need to self-sustain economically and eliminate Western aid dependency altogether. That leads us to today's unraveling of the US policy imposing sanctions and possibly worse measures. We will see some of the inconsistencies, double standards and flat-out hypocrisy that are being used to drum up an assault on this East African country of enormous historical and political significance. US policy double standard. US has been one of the countries providing economic assistance to Ethiopia. It practiced a see no evil policy for the past 27 years of the TPLF administration, as long as Ethiopia is subservient to its wishes in its fight against terror in the Horn of Africa. Helped by the likes of Herman Cohen, the TPLF toppled the Derg regime in 1991. For a quarter of a century, it ruled Ethiopia with an iron fist. It sprayed live bullets on demonstrators, even women and children. Dissidents and journalists jailed and brutally tortured. Ethnic violence and balkanization, extrajudicial and mass killings, sham elections, internet blackouts, dissent crackdown were all the faces of the regime. Ethiopian mothers had cried their hearts out in the 27 years of the TPLF regime. This is the regime that is now fighting to come back to power. So what was the policy of the US on Ethiopia during these dark years? Did they threaten the regime with sanctions? Did they reprimand their subservient officials? Did they place sanctions on officials who were terrorizing the people with the barrel of a gun and live ammunition? Did they place sanctions on corrupt officials and their US bank accounts? Did they suspend aid or threaten sanctions when more than 100,000 citizens were sacrificed in the Ethio-Eritrean War? The answer to all is no. So, one would ask, does it make sense? It clearly doesn't. If so, what is the real thing bothering the US? We have noted three main reasons in our introduction. In this segment we will address the first one. In this video, we are not going to talk about scientific details or timelines of events, as this is not our intent. What we want to point out is context and reasoning for the viewer to ask himself or herself the question, does this make sense? The Nile River originates from the Ethiopian highlands and flows into the Sudan and Egypt. Most of Egypt's livelihood is dependent on the river. In fact, most of the cities are built along the basins of this river. For centuries, Egypt and the Sudan have been sole beneficiaries of the river. Although Ethiopia has been contemplating on utilizing projects for its people, it hasn't materialized mostly because of the resistance of these downstream countries. Finally, in 2011 Ethiopia said, I need to provide electricity to the 60% of my population that is living in the dark. The groundbreaking project of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, also known as the GERD, was born. This is a hydroelectric project where water goes in, spins turbines to make electricity and make its way to its usual destination. None of the Western countries and their financial arms like the IMF were willing to put a dime. The project was in alignment with the clean energy initiatives of US and Western world. Egypt vehemently opposed to the project and no one was willing to cross Egypt. Because of the enormous cost and investment of this project, everyone assumed that Ethiopia cannot pull this through and make it a reality. But Ethiopians surprised everyone by pulling together and fund the project with their own purse. It has grown to be a national pride and Ethiopians remain adamant to see it through. When Abiy Ahmed assumed power, one of the first tasks he had undertaken was to clean up the management of the project and hire essential resources. Showing good progress, he galvanized and rallied up Ethiopians to a historic completion of the dam which took the world by surprise. The political temperature between Ethiopia, Egypt and Sudan shifted to high gear once again. The major contention points boiled down to the following. Egypt wants an ironclad commitment of a guaranteed amount of water even during drought seasons where there is shortage of rainfall. Ethiopia says it can't bind itself in a guarantee as it cannot dictate climate conditions. Equitable water usage where each country gets a certain percentage will also needs to be worked out. United States has tried to play a mediator role during both the Trump and Biden administrations. The problem is that US has a vested interest on Egypt. Egypt is the go-between with the Arabs and Israel whenever the chronically entrenched Middle East conflicts rekindle. As such, Egypt is the second highest recipient of US aid, close to $1 billion on average every year. So instead of being an honest negotiator, it exerts undue pressure on Ethiopia in favor of Egypt.
Egypt is not going to be able to live that way. And they'll end up blowing up the dam, and I said it, and I say it loud and clear, they'll blow up that dam, and they have to do something. So whatever you can do to get them, Ethiopia, to do that, they're going to have to, okay? And we've cut off all payment and everything else to Ethiopia. It was terrible.
The UN Security Council that deals with massive world crisis has already met twice on this issue because of pressure from Egypt and Sudan. Convening to debate border-crossing river disputes was unprecedented in the history of the Council. Eventually, the Council, probably conscious of its breach of mandate, recommended the negotiations to be mediated by the African Union. Egypt didn't like this ruling and still pressuring the United Nations to continue involvement. Now let's come to the sensitive situation of the war in Tigray, the pretext to justify sanctions. War is a horrifying event. Ethiopians know war because they have lived it almost all their lives. Historic times of the war with Italy and colonialism, the Ethio-Eritrea War, the Somalia War and the internal war with TPLF are some that can be cited. Ethiopians have died by the hundreds of thousands in these wars. So yes, they know the cost of conflicts. That is why when the current Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power and he preached about peace and reconciliation, Ethiopians were hopeful. But the usual warmongers will not let that happen. They have been unhappy with Abiy's government since the beginning, as they hold grudge for losing power. On November 4, 2020, TPLF forces attacked the northern Ethiopian army that was stationed in Tigray. They ambushed the troops while they are sleeping in their barracks, and slaughtered hundreds of soldiers and injured thousands. The rest fought their way out and escaped to the neighboring regions and Eritrea. This malicious act led to the declaration of TPLF as a terrorist group by the country's parliament. Ethiopian army unfortunately had to go to war once again, to defend its people and bring the criminals to justice. After 8 months of campaign, several of the ringleaders were either killed or captured. The situation created enormous pressure on the government to consider what it claimed to be a strategic withdrawal. This was hoped to give humanitarian organizations better latitude for their efforts, and grace period in the rainy season for farmers to plow. It was expected for TPLF and its supporters to reflect and reciprocate. Contrary to expectations, the TPLF has extended its incursions into neighboring Amhara and Afar regions. The war continues, and so does the death and suffering of Ethiopians. Hundreds of United Nations aid trucks carrying food and medical supplies went into the region and are not being returned. They are ceased to be used for transporting young fighters. Yes, TPLF is taking children from their mothers and sending them to war as cannon fodders. Even after these crimes continued, the US and the Western world continued their quarrelsome engagement with Ethiopian government. They refused to acknowledge the critical piece of who started the war, and the unimaginable crime that was committed on November 4. Even after the TPLF itself admitted the attack on the Ethiopian army was a preemptive strike. Imagine this happening anywhere in the world. A legitimate government being mocked and negotiating a peace deal on equal terms with such a rogue actor, or a government's attempt to bring them to justice so curiously opposed to. This twisted response of the US and the Western world has emboldened the outlaws to scale up their atrocities into the neighboring regions. So why is this uneven pressure by the US and the Western world? Could they be secretly rooting for the TPLF and the downfall of Abiy's government? The usual drumbeat of genocide and ethnic cleansing, ignoring the fact that victims of the war include Amharas, Oromos and other ethnic groups. Is it an excuse to unleash power? Is this the Iraq War and the WMD moment?
What happened in 9/11 is we didn't have a strategy, we didn't have bipartisan agreement, we didn't have American understanding of it, and we had instead a policy coup in this country. A coup. A policy coup. Some hard-nosed people took over the direction of American policy, and they never bothered to inform the rest of us. I went through the Pentagon 10 days after 9/11. I couldn't stay away from Mother Army. I went back there to see Don Rumsfeld. I'd worked for him as a White House fellow in the 1970s. All this is in the book. And I said, "Am I doing okay on CNN?" He said, yeah, fine. He said, "I'm thinking about it." He says, "I read your book," and he said, this is a book that talks about the Kosovo campaign, and he said, "I just want to tell you," he said, "nobody's going to tell us where or when we can bomb. Nobody." He said, "I'm thinking of calling this a floating coalition. What do you think about that?" I said, "Well, sir, thanks for reading my book, and, he said, "Thanks, that's all the time I've got." Really? And I went downstairs. I was leaving the Pentagon, and an officer from the Joint Staff called me into his office and said, I want you to know," he said, "sir, we're going to attack Iraq." And I said, "Why?" He said, "We don't know." He said, I said, "Well, did they tie Saddam to 9/11? He said, "No." He said, "But I guess they don't know what to do about terrorism, and so they think, but they can attack states and they want to look strong, and so I guess they think if they take down a state, it will intimidate the terrorists. And you know, it's like that old saying he said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem has to be a nail. Well, I walked out of there pretty upset, and then we attacked Afghanistan. I was pretty happy about that. We should have. And then I came back to the Pentagon about 6 weeks later. I saw the same officer. I said, why haven't we attacked Iraq? We still going to attack Iraq? He said, oh, sir. He says, it's worse than that. He said, he pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office that says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. I said, 7 countries in 5 years. I said, is that a classified memo? He said, yes, sir. I said, well, don't show it to me. He was about to show it to me. He said, because I want to talk about it. And I sat on this information for a long time, for about 6 or 8 months. I was so stunned by this, I couldn't begin to talk about it.
The media bias. The onslaught of the media bias has shocked the world and certainly Ethiopians. Mainstream medias are filled with articles and news that are very skewed and sympathize the TPLF criminal forces. Let's see some of the tactics used by the TPLF and its propaganda machinery to dominate the airwaves. TPLF has a sophisticated foreign media machinery known as Tigray Media House that is funded by the billions of dollars the group embezzled while in power for more than a quarter of a century. This organization reaches out to reputable news outlet reporters, offering inside sources. Reporters who are dying to get stories agree to this arrangement and interview staged-up subjects that are sympathizers or members of the TPLF. They make sure their identity is kept anonymous. Tactics and patterns that are being witnessed in the mainstream media to be willfully being used for undue pressure are treating TPLF on equal footing as the federal government, emboldening their persona, heavily criticizing the Ethiopian government's actions and not giving enough attention to their responses for baseless accusations, willfully ignoring the source of these problems and the culprits, exaggerate numbers and dramatize events for news consumption. CNN reporter Nima Elbagir made multiple investigative reporting segments. She was accompanied by TPLF gangs and sympathizers while in Tigray. The ugly side of war is unquestionable, and she should know the power of her camera being used as a propaganda machine. Did Nima Elbagir try to pass by the Amhara or Afar regions where human sufferings are occurring? No, because it conflicts with the narrative that Tigrayans are being ethnic cleansed. US politicians are willfully gobbling up this genocide echo chamber and use it as a tool to mount undue pressure. Here is some ideas to Nima, CNN, and other investigative reporters. How about investigating what happened in Tigray on November 4 when the northern Ethiopian army is attacked by TPLF? What happened to the hundreds of the United Nations aid trucks that went to Tigray and are seized by TPLF? What happened in Mai Kadra on November 9 and 10 when the fleeing TPLF massacred thousands of Amhara women and children? Or how about a story about the US national security issue of the negatively changing sentiment of Ethiopians towards the United States? Those are answers you should seek if you want to be balanced and unbiased reporter in search of facts. War is something that has a massive consequence for people involved. Don't fan the flame and report facts without bias.